Welcome to Psychology Daf. We're on Gemara Pesachim, Daf Ayin Gimel, and today I want to talk to you about the social convention of Kollel, not the idea of learning Torah with Mesiras Nefesh, which is clearly something that must be done throughout the generations, and any great scholar in Torah, actually any great scholar in anything, must be willing and will undergo tremendous deprivation in order to make sacrifices for their study, because intellectual pursuits oftentimes do not yield financial benefit. And that's something that obviously is part and parcel of any serious Torah study. I want to talk about the social convention of Kollel, meaning there's an idea that young people get married, and for a certain number of years the parents support them for the husband to be learning in Kollel. And that idea has a lot of benefits, one would imagine, and that's why the parents buy into it. Hopefully more than just social pressure, but the parents buy into it because they want the young couple to start out with a foundation of Torah, to start out with a foundation of learning. Now, this has nothing to do with raising a generation of rabbinic leaders or promoting scholars. Most of the people that are in Kollel for a few years after they get married are not necessarily going to stay in learning, or are not necessarily cut out as the greatest sages. There's just this idea that it's a good idea for a young couple getting started out to be supported so that they could have the experience of living a much more Torah life, kind of like, Man in the wilderness. The Jews wandered in the wilderness. There was no expectation that real life would continue that way once they came to Eretz Yisrael. They would have to plant for themselves. But they were in the middle of a very intense spiritual state, and that needed to be incubated, as it were. So I always assumed that something like that was a product of a relatively affluent modern society, meaning because we have the ability to do this, fortunately, we are going to do this. I would imagine in Europe, even single people couldn't afford to learn and had to work, and that was probably more the norm than anything else. So I was a bit surprised when I saw Pri Tzaddik, which seems to describe exactly the social institution of Kollel in his time. Now, he died in the year 1900, so he was basically a 19th century scholar, and that's the Pri Tzaddik is Rav Tzadok HaKohen Milublin, very famous Talmud Chacham and Rebbe. So what does he say, and how does he relate to this Gemara? So on the top of Aban Alf, the Gemara tells us that basically it's more of a legalistic idea that a Kohen that consumes truma, as he consumes this truma, this donated food that's set aside for Kohanim to be supported, when he consumes this truma, even throughout the land of Israel, he will be considered as if he's doing avoda. It's almost like an extension of the temple service, even though he's not bringing any korbanos, he's just eating truma, but because it's supporting, presumably, the good deeds and acts of the Kohen, and he's considered a more spiritual person, maybe he's a teacher of Torah, etc., so that consumption is itself a service in the temple. And the Pri Tzaddik makes this point very strongly in B'Shalach, Perek Beis, section Aleph, where he says that it's the Beis HaMikdash's role is to bring basically a divine holiness and sustenance throughout the world, and the Truma is just an extension of that by supporting a Kohen outside of the Beis HaMikdash even, and him consuming this Truma and being supported in his Torah lifestyle, he is furthering God's presence in the world. What's interesting is he says from here we see a support for this custom that many people who love Torah and admire Torah, they support their children after their wedding for many years so that they will have Torah in their hearts, even when they later on have to engage in business as their financial needs and their lifestyle and their family grows. So it's fascinating to see just that this institution that we have, which of course can be quite lovely and beautiful, although I would imagine for some it might be an unfair pressure and burden, both on the part of the parents and the part of the children. So I'm not talking about situations where it's unwelcome or unhelpful, but here we see a very interesting institution that actually is being supported by somebody who never really understood or knew about American lifestyle.